Hello there, this is Rod with Rod's Media Room, and today I'm being picky. I am trying to figure out what the difference is between a director's cut, a special edition, a final cut, and whatever else kind of cut. I need to get to the bottom of this problem. So we are going to do a case study of some movies. And I promise I will not continue talking like this because it's kind of annoying. So here are just a few movies that have different editions available, different cuts. And from near as what I can tell, a director's cut is a movie that was initially cut that way by the director, and then the studio interfered before the movie was released to theaters and made changes. A good example of a director's cut would be this DVD release of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Oddly enough, the only way you can see the director's cut is on DVD. They call it a director's edition, close enough. But that is a good example of a director's cut. Now, a special edition is a movie that has already been released to theaters, and new footage has been added. So, new effects, maybe even some new sequences shot with actors, have been added to the movies. So the Star Wars special editions are great examples, obviously. But also, an earlier example would be Close Encounters of the Third Kind, released originally in 1977, and then re-released in 1980 as a special edition. And of course, there is also another cut, which is called a director's cut, but to me, I would consider it a final cut, because to me, that means a movie that was edited by the director after the fact. So, after the movie's release, the director wasn't happy with it and wanted to make some changes. But to differentiate it from a director's cut, I would call it director's final cut. So, they don't quite use the right term here. But special edition was first used, I think, in context of Close Encounters. Now, one movie that definitely gets it all right is the Blade Runner set, because they actually use all the correct terminology here. The original theatrical cut, US, original theatrical international. This set also includes the director's cut and the final cut. And to me, this is a good example of all of those types of cuts. The director's cut wasn't released until much later, but from what I understand, it was the original cut that Ridley Scott wanted to release in theaters, but the studio wanted to add narration and make some subtle changes. And so yeah, I completely agree with all of the cuts listed here. THX 1138. Boy, do I disagree with a lot of these. George Lucas director's cut. Actually, I would consider this a final cut. Consider a terrible final cut at that, but yes, final cut. And on Laserdisc, it was released just under its title, which would make you think this is the theatrical version, but it is not. It is actually a director's cut, because THX 1138 was released in theaters in a different form that has never been released on home video, officially, as far as I know, anyway. The changes are really subtle, much like American Graffiti, because there were some subtle changes from the theatrical cuts to the VHS and Laserdisc versions that came out later. They're very subtle, though. And once Star Wars was a huge success, George Lucas had a lot of power, so he went back to Warner Brothers and Universal and said, put my movies the way I wanted them in the first place. And in that respect, I agree with George. I think he did the right thing. I can't say I feel the same about special editions, but that's a whole different topic. Superman, there's the original theatrical cut, obviously, and then there's what they call the expanded or extended cut, which is a strange name. I would consider it a final cut, because it's Richard Donner's final cut, but they call it expanded. I can accept that, but in my books, it's a final cut. Oddly enough, if you wanted the theatrical cut, for the longest time, the only way you could get it was on Laserdisc, because the first DVD version was only the expanded cut. It wasn't until a little bit later that they finally put the theatrical cut on DVD and, of course, Blu-ray. So, yeah. And then, of course, the other Star Trek movie, being Star Trek the Motion Picture, the special longer version. Really, this is the television cut. This was the version that was aired on TV way back in the day. It's kind of a dumb name. The SLV, maybe? Anyway. Star Trek on DVD, they call it a director's edition, but really, I would consider this to be a director's final cut, or a special edition, because it does have enhanced effects, new special effects. Oddly enough, this movie was never released on Blu-ray. It's only available on DVD, because the enhanced effects were only done at 480p, which means they weren't good enough to really upscale to a Blu-ray. So the Blu-ray actually is the original theatrical version. Anyway, so that's some babbling on about different types of cuts and different types of editions. Another good example, of course, Ridley Scott with Alien. I think he used good terminology there. Ridley Scott seems to know. He does his stuff right. And everybody should release their stuff like this on Blu-ray with all of the cuts. All of the cuts in one release. That is fantastic. Anyway, I'm going to stop babbling now. That's me just being very picky, and I'm just trying to sort it out. What is a special edition? What is a director's cut? Will somebody tell me? Well, I kind of told myself. Is that the same as telling myself off? Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now. Later.